Title: Silent Whispers. Chapter 1: The Whispering Dark. The night was unusually still. A deep silence, thick and suffocating, clung to the walls of the house. It was as if the very air held its breath, waiting for something unspeakable to emerge from the dark. Lily sat in her bed, hugging her knees to her chest, staring at the ceiling. The soft rustling of the leaves outside, the occasional creak of the old house settling. These were familiar sounds, ones that usually comforted her. But tonight, they felt wrong. Her mother had kissed her goodnight, as she always did, with the same sweet scent of lavender lingering on her skin, the same warm smile that always made Lily feel safe. "Sleep tight, my darling," she whispered softly. But when Lily looked up to meet her mother's eyes, she saw something that made her blood run cold, a flicker of something she couldn't place. It was as though her mother's gaze held an unspoken warning, a silent plea, and then, in an instant, it was gone. Her mother had turned away, her long dark hair swishing behind her as she closed the door quietly behind her. A soft click echoed in the room, and Lily was left alone with the shadows. For a moment, nothing moved. The room was bathed in the soft, warm glow of the nightlight, a single flickering point of comfort in the otherwise oppressive darkness. But the shadows, they seemed to stretch longer tonight, slithering along the edges of the room like something alive. Lily's heart beat faster as she pulled the blanket up to her chin, trying to convince herself that it was nothing. Just her imagination, just the fear that always crept in after bedtime. She tried to close her eyes, to ignore the eerie feeling that wrapped itself around her like a cold, invisible hand. But the room seemed to breathe with her, the walls expanding and contracting with every inhale, every exhale. The silence, instead of soothing her, pressed heavily against her ears, making every small sound, the faint rustle of fabric, the squeak of floorboards outside her door, feel amplified. She shifted in bed, trying to find a comfortable position, but the bed felt foreign, too soft, too cold. Her eyes scanned the room again, the same familiar objects, the toys on the shelves, the stack of books by the window, the stuffed animals lined up at the foot of the bed. But tonight, they seemed different, their shapes twisted in the dim light, shadows playing tricks on her mind. The toys were no longer just toys. They were eyes, watching, waiting. The books no longer seemed to hold stories, but secrets, buried deep within their pages. And the stuffed animals, they were too still, too quiet. She couldn't remember them being so lifeless before. Lily shifted again, unease prickling her skin. The blankets felt too tight, as though the room itself was closing in on her. She pulled the covers off, her feet hitting the cold wooden floor, and swung her legs over the edge of the bed. The floorboards creaked under her weight, a sound that felt louder than it should have. She froze, holding her breath. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "There's nothing to fear in the dark, darling." But the voice felt distant now, as if it came from somewhere far away, somewhere unreachable. She stood, her bare feet pressing against the floor, feeling the roughness of the wood beneath her. Every sound felt unnaturally loud now, every creak, every whisper. Her body was tense, and she wasn't sure why. She wasn't sure what she was expecting. She only knew that something wasn't right. The house, which had always felt so warm, so full of life, now felt like a hollow shell, empty, empty of everything, except the whispers. The whispers. At first she thought they were just the wind, howling through the cracks in the old house. But as she listened more closely, the sound was unmistakable. A voice. Faint, almost imperceptible, like a far-off murmur from the corners of the room. It wasn't her mother's voice. It wasn't anyone she knew. It was something else. Something that didn't belong. She pressed her ear to the wall, listening. The voice came from within, from deep in the shadows of the room, from places that shouldn't have been capable of sound. Lily's breath quickened. She turned toward the corner of the room where the shadows seemed deepest, where the walls seemed to twist unnaturally. For a moment she thought she saw a figure, a silhouette standing just beyond the edge of her vision. She blinked, but when she looked again, it was gone. Her heart hammered in her chest. She wanted to call out for her mother, to run to her, to throw herself into her comforting embrace. But the voice, the whispering, held her in place. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. She could only listen as the darkness seemed to press in on her, suffocating her. The air in the room grew colder, the temperature dropping with every passing second. She shivered, her skin prickling, goosebumps rising along her arms. She reached for the nightlight, the small flickering bulb that had always made her feel safe, but it had gone out. The room was plunged into darkness, a thick, impenetrable blackness that swallowed everything around her. The whispers grew louder. Lily. It was her name, soft and sweet, yet strangely chilling. The voice felt as though it came from inside her own head, but also from the walls, from the very air itself. It was everywhere and nowhere. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing through her ears. Her feet felt heavy as she moved toward the door, her hands trembling as she reached for the doorknob. She turned it slowly, desperately wanting to escape. But the door wouldn't budge. Her breath caught in her throat. She twisted the knob harder, pulling against it, but it wouldn't open. The room felt like it was closing in on her. The whispers surrounded her, echoing through her mind, louder and louder until they became a roar, a deafening sound that rattled her bones. Lily! Her name again, but this time it was not just a whisper. It was a command, an order, and it came from right behind her. She spun around, her eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows, stretching and twisting in unnatural shapes. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She could only hear the voice, the whispers, the shadows that seemed to creep closer with every passing second. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the room fell silent. The whispers disappeared, leaving only the sound of her frantic breathing. The darkness remained, thick and suffocating, but there was no more voice, no more sound, no more movement. It was as though the room had been emptied, as though whatever had been there was gone. Lily blinked, her eyes adjusting to the dark. She reached for the door again, but this time it opened easily. She stepped into the hallway, her heart still pounding in her chest. The house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. The normal creaks and groans of the old building were gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness that made her feel as though the house itself was holding its breath. She tiptoed down the hall, her bare feet barely making a sound on the cool floorboards. Her mother's room was at the end of the hall, and the light under the door was still on. But as Lily approached, she stopped. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, she could see something that made her stomach turn. Her mother was standing by the window, facing away from her. Her figure was still and unmoving, her back stiff and rigid, as though she were frozen in place. The air around her seemed to ripple, the shadows shifting strangely. Lily's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't how her mother stood. This wasn't her mother at all. The figure turned slowly, its face emerging from the shadows, and Lily's heart froze in her chest. The face was not her mother's. It was pale, gaunt, its eyes hollow and dark, like empty wells that seemed to stare straight through her. The mouth twisted into a smile, but it wasn't a smile of warmth or comfort. It was a smile of something darker, something ancient, something hungry. And then, in a voice that was not her mother's, it whispered, "I've been waiting for you, Lily." The door slammed shut in her face, and the whispers returned, louder now, more frantic, more insistent. The darkness was no longer a simple absence of light. It was a presence, a force, and it was coming for her. Chapter 1. The Whispering Dark continued. Lily's heart was racing. The sudden slam of the door echoed in the hallway like a gunshot, its sound so deafening that she felt it reverberate deep within her chest. For a moment she just stood there, paralyzed, her back pressed against the cold wall. The shadows in the hallway seemed to close in on her, wrapping around her like a tightening noose. She blinked, trying to clear her mind, to make sense of what she had just seen. But the image of her mother, no, that thing, was burned into her memory. The hallway was dim, the light from the lamps flickering like dying stars, casting grotesque, elongated shadows along the walls. It was as though the house itself was alive, each creak and groan a voice from the depths, whispering things Lily couldn't hear, but felt deep in her bones. The whispers had returned, louder this time, echoing through the walls and floors. They weren't just in her head anymore. They were real, tangible, a presence she couldn't ignore. "Lily," the voice called again, but this time it wasn't from behind her. It was from everywhere. From the floorboards beneath her feet, from the cracks in the walls, from the dark recesses of the house itself. It sounded like her name, but it was distorted, twisted, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison, layered on top of one another. The syllables of her name stretched and bent, as though each letter was a cold metallic blade scraping against her spine. Lily took a hesitant step forward, her bare feet making a faint, soft thud against the wood as she crept toward her mother's room. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, each movement sluggish, as if something was trying to hold her in place. The air around her felt thick, almost suffocating, and her breath caught in her throat, but still she pressed on. Something inside her, something primal, told her that she had to move, she had to escape. When she reached the door to her mother's room, she paused, her hand hovering above the doorknob. It was the same door she had walked through countless times before, the door that had always felt like a sanctuary, a place of comfort and warmth. But now, it felt like a gateway to something darker, something that was waiting for her, lurking behind it. Her fingers trembled as they brushed against the cool metal of the handle, and she hesitated once more. The whispers were louder now, a frantic cacophony in her ears, urging her forward. "Lily, Lily, come closer." It was no longer a single voice, but a chorus of voices, overlapping and distorting, as if the very walls were speaking to her, beckoning her into the room. She opened the door. The room was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the dim glow of the street lamp outside the window, casting long, spindly shadows across the floor. Her mother's figure was still at the window, her back to Lily, but the stillness of her posture now felt wrong, unnatural. Her shoulders were unnervingly rigid, her hair hanging limp and lifeless, like strands of dry grass caught in a storm. Lily's eyes widened as she stepped closer. Her mother's form seemed to shimmer, as though it wasn't entirely solid, as though it was something fragile, something that could slip away if she looked away for too long. The air in the room grew colder, a biting chill creeping up her arms, sending shivers down her spine. "Mom?" Lily whispered, her voice shaking. She didn't know why she was still trying to speak to this thing, this imposter, but the need for reassurance was overwhelming. "Mum, it's me." But there was no response. The figure didn't even flinch. It was as if Lily wasn't even there, as if the creature wasn't aware of her presence. Her heart thudded in her chest, each beat like a heavy drum in her ears. And then, the creature moved. It wasn't a smooth motion, like a person turning around. No, it was jerky, mechanical, as though its limbs were not quite connected, as though it had to relearn how to function with each movement. The figure slowly rotated, its head twisting unnaturally, the movement so grotesque that Lily had to choke back a scream. When it finally faced her, its face was pale, deathly pale, with eyes that were wide, unblinking, hollow black voids that seemed to stare right through her. There was no warmth, no love, no recognition in those eyes, just an empty abyss. The mouth opened, but it wasn't her mother's voice that came out. It was a low, guttural rasp, like dry leaves scraping against stone. "Lily." The voice was harsh, distorted, like something was eating her name, swallowing it piece by piece. Lily stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but her legs felt weak. She couldn't move fast enough. The thing took a step toward her, its movements slow but deliberate. Its eyes locked on hers, like it was savoring her fear. The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, stretching toward her like fingers, crawling across the walls. The whispering, the voices, the thing, it was all too much. She turned, her legs shaking as she fled down the hallway, her heart pounding in her throat. The cold air felt like ice on her skin, and as she ran, the house seemed to shift around her. The familiar walls, the narrow staircase, the windows, everything was warping, changing, as though the house itself had become a living, breathing entity, pushing her towards something she couldn't understand. She reached the stairs and nearly tripped. her foot catching on the edge of the step. The world around her spun, the darkness closing in. The whispers were getting louder, more urgent. They were all around her, suffocating her, drowning her in their demands. Lily, Lily, you can't escape. She ignored the voice. She had to escape. She had to get out of the house. But when she reached the front door and tried to open it, the handle wouldn't turn. She twisted it, panicking, but it was stuck, frozen. A cold laughter echoed from behind her. Lily turned, her eyes wide with terror. The creature, her mother, was standing at the bottom of the stairs now, its eyes gleaming with malevolent delight. The smile on its face was stretching wider, impossibly wide, its teeth sharp and uneven, like broken glass. You can't leave, it hissed. Not yet. Not until you understand. Lily's mind raced. She had to get out. She had to wake up. But as she turned back to the door, the whispers, the thing, the suffocating weight of the shadows, they were all closing in on her. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The door remained locked. The creature's eyes bored into her. And in that moment, Lily understood. The house wasn't just alive. It had been waiting for her all along. And now, there was no way out. The last thing she heard was the soft, mocking voice of the creature, whispering in her ear, "Welcome home, Lily." Chapter 2. The Hollow Echoes. Lily's chest heaved as she stumbled backward, her heart a frantic, erratic drumbeat against her ribs. The air felt thick, too thick, like the very atmosphere in the house was suffused with a presence, a pressure that pushed in from all sides. She tried to breathe, to calm herself, but every inhale felt like drowning in ice water, and every exhale was a struggle, a battle to keep the panic from overtaking her. The house, once her sanctuary, once a place she called home, now seemed to mock her. The old wood creaked under her feet, as though it was laughing. No, jeering at her. Each step a reminder that there was nowhere safe. Not here. Not anywhere. Her fingers trembled as they clutched the door handle again, this time with desperate force. The door had been locked, frozen in place as though the house itself had sealed her in. She yanked at it, pulling with every ounce of strength, but it wouldn't budge. She could feel the coldness of the knob seep into her palm, the chill from it sinking into her bones, a sensation that made her feel cold inside, as if her very soul had begun to freeze. Her mind raced, searching for an explanation, some kind of logic, something that could make sense of what she was seeing. Her mother, no, that thing, was still standing at the base of the stairs, its distorted smile still frozen on its face, that wide gaping maw filled with too many teeth, far too many teeth. The black eyes gleamed with a malevolent hunger that sent ice through her veins. She couldn't understand it. None of it made sense. The shadows in the house, the whispers, the feeling of being suffocated by the very air around her. It was all so wrong. Everything about this house was wrong. She wasn't just trapped by the locked door. She was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. And worst of all, she knew that whatever had taken her mother's place, it wasn't going to let her leave. Lily. The voice, that twisted, otherworldly voice, echoed again, this time softer, almost coaxing. You can't leave, Lily. You have to understand. The creature's voice seemed to slither around her like smoke, curling into her ears, coating her thoughts with something darker, deeper. The words were not comforting, not even close. They were cold, distant, like a command from some faraway, incomprehensible place. It wasn't her mother's voice. It couldn't be. Understand what? Lily whispered, her voice weak, hoarse, barely a whisper in the cavernous space of the hall. She wasn't sure if she even wanted the answer, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to know. The thing didn't answer at first. Instead, it just stood there, its body unnaturally still, its smile stretching wider, impossibly wider. It tilted its head, like a curious animal observing something, studying it. And then, finally, it spoke again. Its voice was a low, rasping sound that echoed off the walls like distant thunder. This house has always been waiting for you, Lily. The thing's eyes, those hollow black pits, narrowed. This house Needs you. The word sent a shiver crawling up Lily's spine, as if something had reached inside her, taken hold of her very soul. She felt herself shrinking, as though the walls of the house were closing in on her, bending her will, making her feel so small, so helpless. "No," Lily managed, her voice breaking. "You're not my mother. You're not her." The thing's lips curled upward in what could only be described as a grotesque parody of a smile. It was almost laughing at her, the way its mouth stretched wider and wider, its teeth glistening in the dim light, as though they were made of something sharper than bone. "Your mother," it said, its voice a caress of cold, its words like whispers of decay. "She's gone, Lily, gone and never coming back. But you are here, and that's all that matters." Lily recoiled, fear shooting through her. Her mother was gone. She didn't want to believe it. She couldn't believe it. But the thing standing in front of her, it wasn't her mother. It wasn't even human. It was something older, something darker, something that had been lying in wait, hidden in the very foundation of the house. She turned away from it, her eyes desperately scanning the hallway for an escape, for something, anything, that might offer a glimmer of hope. The house was suffocating her. The walls seemed to lean closer, the shadows around her darker, thicker. The whispers filled her ears again, louder, frantic, as if the house itself were alive, whispering to her from every corner. "Lily, Lily, don't fight it. You belong here." A sharp sound interrupted the whispering. A bang. It came from above, from the attic. A loud, violent thud, as though something had been thrown across the floor. Lily froze, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't heard any noise from the attic before, not like this. It was as though something had been awakened. "Go to the attic, Lily," the creature said, its voice laced with malice. "It's time for you to see it for yourself. Time to understand." The suggestion felt like a weight pressing on her chest, suffocating her. She couldn't move. She couldn't even think. Every part of her screamed to run, to escape. But the house, the thing, had already gotten inside her. It was pulling her in, wrapping its tendrils around her heart. The attic. She didn't want to go to the attic. The attic was where the darkness began. She had always avoided it, ever since she was a little girl. Her mother had warned her to stay away from the attic, but that was before the whispers had started, before the shadows had taken on lives of their own. Lily didn't want to go, but she knew that she didn't have a choice. There was no escaping the house, not anymore. With a shudder, she turned toward the stairs leading up to the attic. Each step seemed heavier than the last, the wood creaking under her weight as though it was protesting her every move. The whispering grew louder as she ascended, filling her mind with promises and threats. 1,000 voices murmuring in her ears, all at once. "You don't know what's up there, but you will. Soon, soon, you will understand everything." The attic door was at the top of the stairs, looming over her, dark and imposing. It had always been locked when she was younger, a barrier that kept her away from the secrets the house held. But now, as she reached for the door handle, it was already ajar, as if it had been waiting for her. Her fingers brushed against the cold wood of the door, and she hesitated. Her mind screamed at her to turn around, to run, but her body moved on its own, drawn to the darkened room beyond. She pushed the door open. Inside, the attic was a graveyard of forgotten things. Dust-covered furniture, old trunks, forgotten boxes of family heirlooms. All things that had once been important, now relegated to the forgotten corners of the house. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, a damp, musty odor that made her stomach turn. And in the center of the room, standing on a wooden pedestal, was a mirror. Lily's breath caught in her throat. It was a large antique mirror, framed in dark wood that was chipped and scarred with age, but it wasn't the mirror itself that made her heart race. It was the reflection. Her reflection. But it wasn't her reflection. The figure in the mirror was her, but not her. Her face was distorted, her features twisted into something monstrous. Her eyes were black, just like the thing that had taken her mother's place. Her mouth hung open, frozen in a silent scream, the edges of her lips curling in a grotesque parody of a smile. She reached out a trembling hand toward the mirror, drawn to it, unable to stop herself. The coldness of the glass seemed to pulse under her touch, as though the mirror were alive, feeding off her fear. And then, something moved behind her. The sound was soft at first, a faint scrape against the floor, but it grew louder, closer. She turned, her heart pounding in her chest, her blood running cold. The attic door slammed shut behind her. Chapter 2. The Hollow Echoes continued. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash, the sound reverberating through the attic like thunder in the dead of night. The vibration of it seemed to rattle the very bones of the house, shaking the dust from the rafters and sending a wave of terror crashing over Lily. She whirled around, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. There was no escape now. The air in the attic felt suffocating, thick with an oppressive weight that pressed against her lungs. She reached for the door handle, her fingers numb, but when she turned it, it was as if the door itself had been glued shut. Her hand slipped from the cold metal, and panic clawed at her throat. She pulled again, desperately, but the door refused to open. The house had sealed her in, trapped. There was no way out, no escape from the nightmare that was consuming her. Behind her, the mirror stood, still reflecting her twisted image. But now, it wasn't just a reflection. It felt like a window, a portal to something darker, something far more sinister. Her own face stared back at her, but it wasn't her. The eyes in the mirror were wrong, black voids. There was no soul behind them, no warmth, just darkness. And then, the reflection moved. Her own face twisted, the smile stretching unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged, sharp teeth. Teeth that seemed to grow longer, sharper with each passing second. It was like watching a shadow shift, distorting into something vile and otherworldly. Her reflection inched closer to the glass, as though it were trying to reach out to her, to pull her in. The image flickered like an old film reel, and for a fleeting moment, it looked as if something else was behind her. Something huge, something monstrous, its shadow stretching across the attic floor. Lily froze. The creature in the reflection, it wasn't her anymore. It was them, the thing that had stolen her mother's body. The thing that had been whispering in her ears, coaxing her to this moment. It was inside the mirror, behind the glass, watching her, waiting. Then, the whispering began again. "Come closer, Lily. Come closer and see." The voice was soft, almost tender, like a lover's call in the dark. But Lily could feel the malice behind it, a predatory hunger that chilled her to the bone. Her skin crawled as she stood frozen in place. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, each word dripping with venom. "You can't fight it. You belong to this house. You always have." Lily turned, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind her. Something moving in the dark corners of the room. Something that had been there all along, waiting. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, as if they were alive, curling and twisting in impossible shapes. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, she spun around, her eyes searching the room. But there was nothing there. Nothing but the oppressive darkness that seemed to crawl into every corner, filling the space like a living thing. The attic had grown colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that she could see her breath fogging in front of her. And then, the sound. A soft scuttling noise from above, from the rafters. The distinct sound of something moving, something large and heavy. Her pulse quickened as she glanced up, her eyes straining to see in the dark. Nothing. The silence stretched. For a moment, she dared to believe it was just her mind, playing tricks on her. But then, it came again, closer this time. The scratching, the skittering, like something crawling through the beams above her head. Her breath hitched. Slowly, cautiously, she tilted her head upward, her eyes scanning the darkness of the rafters. And then she saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a fleeting movement in the corner of her vision. But then it came into focus, something large and grotesque, perched in the rafters above her. It had no shape, no clear form, just a mass of shifting darkness that seemed to pulse, writhing like a living thing. Eyes, many, many eyes, glowed in the depths of the black mass, each one a small, glimmering pinprick of light in the utter darkness. They blinked in unison, tracking her every movement. "Lily!" The voice came again, this time from the shadow above her. "Come to me, Lily. Come see what awaits you." Lily's breath caught in her throat, her hands trembling as they gripped the edges of the mirror. The thing in the rafters, it wasn't just watching her, it was calling to her, urging her toward the glass, drawing her closer, pulling her in. Her legs felt weak, as though her bones had turned to jelly, but still, her feet moved toward the mirror, as though some invisible force was pushing her forward. Her reflection in the glass twisted again, its smile stretching wider, wider, until the edges of its lips seemed to crack and bleed. The teeth, too many teeth, glistened with the promise of something sharp, something deadly. It was no longer her, it was the thing, the creature, the entity that had taken her mother's place. And now it was inside the mirror, inside her. "You'll never leave, Lily. You never belonged in this world anyway. You were always meant to be here, with us." The words burrowed into her mind, filling every crevice, every dark thought. She could feel the cold fingers of despair creeping up her spine, clutching her heart. Her own reflection reached out to her, its hand pressing against the glass, its black eyes glowing with an insidious light. The glass between them rippled, like water disturbed by a stone, as though the surface itself was alive. "Step through. Come, let us show you." Lily's hands shook, but she couldn't stop herself. She reached forward, her fingers touching the glass, the coldness seeping into her skin like ice. The instant her fingers made contact, the reflection in the mirror stirred, the smile stretched even wider, the eyes widening, if that was possible. And then, crack, the glass splintered. A jagged crack ran down the center of the mirror, splitting the image in two. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, the whispering, the movement, the air itself, all held in a stillness that made her heart stop. And then the crack widened. The thing in the mirror didn't hesitate. Its hand, no longer a reflection but a living, breathing thing, reached through the glass, its fingers pale and twisted, sharp like claws, stretching toward her. Lily stumbled backward, but she was too late. The hand closed around her wrist, its grip like iron, cold and unyielding. It pulled her in. The world around her distorted. The attic, the house, everything began to fade, swallowed by the mirror's abyss. She could hear the thing's voice now, clearer than ever, as though it were in her mind, whispering not through the air but in her skull. "You belong to me now. Welcome home, Lily." The darkness consumed her. Chapter 3. The Unraveling. Lily's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The mirror, had swallowed her, and now she was trapped within it. At least, that was how it felt. The air was thick with an unnameable presence, pressing in on her from all sides. Her thoughts spiraled, struggling to find purchase, but they slipped like water through her fingers. The world around her was a pulsating void, black and endless, a nightmarish landscape of shifting shapes and whispers that made no sense. At first, she thought she was still in the attic. The edges of the darkness seemed familiar, the coldness in the air a faint echo of the house she had once known. But then, as her senses returned, she realized it was much worse. This place, this realm, was nothing like the attic. It wasn't even like the house anymore. The floor beneath her feet was soft, like damp earth, but it stretched endlessly in all directions, as if it were made from some strange, living thing that pulsed with every breath she took. The air felt alive, thick with the smell of decay, of rot, of something ancient. It was like walking through the afterlife, if such a place existed. The sky above her was a sickly yellow, streaked with veins of black, like the eye of some unfathomable creature. Watching her from a distance, her heart thudded in her chest as she took a shaky step forward. There were no sounds, no birds, no wind. The world was utterly silent, save for the soft, insistent whispers that filled her mind, curling around her like a noxious fog. They didn't come from anywhere, and yet they came from everywhere, invading her thoughts like parasites. You are here now, Lily. Here with us. Here where you belong. Lily's skin crawled at the voice, or rather the multitude of voices, as if the very air itself had become alive with them. She stumbled, almost tripping over something soft, something that felt like flesh beneath her feet. She gasped, looking down. The ground was moving. It wasn't solid at all. It was like skin, pale and slick, stretching and contracting beneath her, breathing, living, as if the very earth she stood on were a part of the thing that had pulled her here. She backed away from it, but no matter how far she stepped, the earth seemed to shift beneath her, pulling her back toward the center. It's time, Lily, the voice continued, dripping with malice. You are part of us now. Your soul belongs to us, just as your mother's did. The words cut through her like a blade. Her mother. She couldn't stop thinking about her. Her real mother. The one who had loved her, who had raised her. That thing, the creature in her mother's form, had taken her place, had stolen everything from her. And now it was clear. The house had never been a home. It had been a prison, a trap, a place to lure her in, to steal her away, just as it had done with her mother. The air around her grew colder, sharper. The silence deepened, like the calm before a storm. And then, the scratching, that terrible skittering sound, like claws scraping against bone. The sound reverberated in the distance. Lily spun around, eyes wide, searching the vast emptiness. She saw nothing, but she felt it. Something was moving in the shadows, something just beyond her reach, circling her. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, as if the voices were scrambling to reach her, to drown her in their whispers. Come closer, Lily. We've been waiting for you. Before she could react, something moved in the distance, just a flicker at the edge of her vision. It was too fast to fully see, but the shadow was tall, long, unnatural. Her heart skipped a beat. Something was there. Something alive. Don't run, the voice cooed. You can't hide. Not here. Not from us. Lily froze. Every instinct in her screamed at her to flee, but her body refused to obey. It was as though the air itself had clamped around her, holding her in place. Her feet felt heavy, like they were sinking into the earth, and her breath came in shallow gasps. The ground beneath her shifted again, this time with a nauseating wetness, as though something was breathing from below. The whispers were relentless, a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, pressing against her mind. And then it came. The creature emerged from the shadows. It was massive, its form too large to be fully comprehended. It was a thing made of darkness, a mass of writhing shapes that shifted in and out of focus, its movements erratic and unnatural. It had no clear shape, just a swirling, contorting mass of limbs and tendrils, each one stretching out, reaching for her. Eyes. Hundreds of eyes, glowing with a sickly yellow light, blinked in the folds of its mass, watching her, waiting. We are the house, it growled, its voice a guttural rumble that vibrated through the very air. We are the walls, we are the floors, we are everything. Lily took a step back, her heart pounding. She could feel its eyes on her, inside her, burrowing into her skull. The shadows around her shifted, distorting into impossible shapes, and she realized with a sickening jolt that the creature wasn't just in front of her, it was everywhere. You've always been part of this, Lily. You are a part of us. Your mother's blood is our blood. You belong to this place just as she did, just as they did. The creature reached out a tendril, its long, sinewy limbs slithering toward her. The air grew thicker with its presence, and the whispers intensified, as if the house itself was beginning to feed on her fear. The tendril touched her shoulder, cold and slick, like ice against her skin. Lily gasped, her muscles locking in place, as if the thing's touch had numbed her very bones. There's no escape, Lily. The house has claimed you. You are ours. She tried to scream, but her voice was a strangled whisper, caught in her throat. Her eyes darted around the endless landscape of shadows, searching for any sign of escape. But there was nothing. Only the creature, only the eyes, only the whispers that filled her mind. She felt as though she was sinking, drowning in the darkness that stretched out infinitely around her. Her head swam. She could hardly breathe. The pressure was too much. And then, with a sudden violent pull, she was yanked forward, her body wrenched into the creature's embrace. It held her tightly, its body slick and cold, its tendrils wrapping around her, pulling her deeper into the dark mass. She could feel it, feel the house, the creature, the very soul of it, breathing inside her, taking root. It was like being consumed by a living thing, something ancient, something that had existed for far longer than she could understand. "You are one of us, Lily," the voice echoed. "You always have been. Welcome home." The creature's form began to shift, contorting into something more humanoid, though still grotesque. Its eyes were the same, hundreds of them, watching her, unblinking. It grinned at her, a smile that stretched too wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, sharp and black. "It's time to meet the others, Lily." With a sickening lurch, the world around her began to twist, and the shadows grew deeper, more suffocating. She could hear them now, the voices of the others, the ones who had come before her. They were trapped here too, just like her. Their screams echoed in the distance, muffled and distant, as though coming from the very walls themselves. Their whispers joined the chorus, a cacophony of agony, of souls lost in the house, in the darkness. Lily screamed, but the sound was lost, swallowed by the suffocating darkness. Chapter 3. The Unraveling continued. The darkness enveloped her like a suffocating shroud, each breath more labored than the last. Lily could feel herself being pulled deeper into the creature's grasp, its tendrils coiling around her body, holding her like a spider's victim caught in a web. She fought against it, twisting and writhing in vain. But the more she struggled, the tighter the creature's hold became. Its grip was like ice, cold and relentless, draining her strength until she was weak and trembling, unable to move or resist. Her mind raced, her thoughts were scattered, fragmented, struggling to piece together some semblance of reality. But all around her was the endless void. The walls had vanished. There was no ceiling, no floor, no boundaries. It was as if the universe itself had disintegrated, leaving her alone in a space that existed outside of time and place. "Welcome to your new home, Lily," the voice whispered again. But this time it was not just one voice. It was a chorus, 100 voices, 1,000, all speaking in unison, weaving a tapestry of malevolent sound that filled her ears, crawling into her mind. It was as if the house itself was speaking, as if the darkness were alive and conscious, and it had always known her, always waited for her. "We have waited for you, Lily," the voice continued, its tone dripping with mock affection. "You were always meant to be here, just like your mother, just like the others." The mention of her mother sent a chill through Lily's body. She had thought, no, she had hoped, that the thing in the attic, the thing that had taken her mother's body, was simply a twisted reflection of the horrors that now surrounded her. But this was different. This was real. It wasn't just one creature. It was many. And it wasn't confined to the attic. It wasn't confined to the house at all. It was the house. It was the land, the earth beneath her, the air she breathed. It was everywhere. She could feel it now, the weight of the presence, the endless, suffocating pressure of it, pressing in on her from all sides, squeezing the air from her lungs. She gasped for breath, but the air was thick, oily, like it didn't want to be breathed. The more she inhaled, the more the darkness seemed to fill her chest, clogging her lungs, suffocating her from within. "Your mother was a part of us too," the voices crooned, soothing, almost tender, but there was nothing warm about them. "She didn't escape. No one escapes. And now you will join us, Lily. Forever." The tendrils around her began to tighten, and Lily could feel her body being pulled toward the center of the mass. Her skin was slick with cold sweat, her heart pounding in her chest, but no matter how hard she struggled, she could not free herself. It was as if the house itself had swallowed her whole. And then, the ground beneath her feet began to shift again. But this time it was different. The soft, fleshy earth began to pulse, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Something was moving beneath her. Something alive. Something ancient. The very air vibrated with its presence, and Lily could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. A deep guttural growl reverberated through the darkness. "You cannot escape," the voice hissed. But it was not one voice now. It was many, a cacophony of whispers, like the distant murmur of 1,000 forgotten souls. "You were never meant to." Her vision blurred, and suddenly the darkness parted. Just a sliver, a small opening in the void. Through it, she saw something. A shape, a figure standing alone in the distance. It was tall, too tall, and it seemed to shimmer and flicker, like a mirage. She strained to make out its form, but it was distorted, ever shifting, like it couldn't decide what it was. Lily's heart skipped a beat. It was her mother. Or at least, the figure that had looked like her. The woman stood motionless in the distance, her face pale and expressionless, her body draped in the same worn, tattered clothing that Lily remembered her mother wearing before she was taken. The woman's eyes were hollow, dark pools, black as night. They were empty, devoid of recognition. The smile, the twisted, impossible smile, was still there, still stretched across her face, but it was no longer human. "Mother," Lily whispered, though she was not sure if the words ever left her mouth. Her voice seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive silence that surrounded her, but the figure moved nonetheless. Slowly, deliberately, it began to walk toward her. Each step was measured, deliberate, and yet there was something unnerving about it, something unnatural. The shadows around her mother seemed to follow her, stretching and twisting, like they were alive. As the figure drew closer, Lily felt the air grow heavier, the temperature dropping, and the whispers in her mind grew louder, more frantic. Her pulse quickened as the figure neared, its eyes never leaving her face. There was something wrong with the way it moved. It wasn't like a human. There was no grace, no fluidity. It was jerky, mechanical, as if it were a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. "Mother, please," Lily begged, but there was no response. The woman didn't speak. She didn't even seem to see her. She was just there, a hollow echo of the woman Lily had once known. And then, in a flash of unbearable clarity, Lily understood. Her mother wasn't here. Her real mother was long gone. The thing before her was not her mother. Not truly. It was just another creation of the house, another manifestation of the darkness that had taken root here. The real her, the real soul, had been consumed, swallowed whole by whatever malevolent force ruled this place. Lily stumbled back, the tendrils around her tightening further. But the creature, if it could be called that, kept coming. It didn't speak. Didn't need to. It was the house, the land, the darkness. It was everything. And it was nothing. "You will join her soon," the voices whispered in unison, just as she joined us. The figure stopped just in front of her, its hollow eyes now boring into Lily's soul. She wanted to scream, but her throat was tight, constricted by the cold weight of the house's power. The woman raised her hand slowly, almost ceremoniously, and placed it on Lily's forehead. It was cold, colder than anything she had ever felt, colder than death itself. The touch sent a shock of icy terror through her, and for a moment she felt as though her very soul was being pulled out of her body. And then, the figure spoke. Its voice was not human. It was deep, guttural, like the rumbling of the earth itself. "You're already one of us." And that was when Lily felt it. The shift. The house was absorbing her, pulling her apart, pulling her into the very fabric of itself, like it had done with so many others before her. She could feel her memories slipping away, her sense of self unraveling like a thread being slowly pulled from a tattered garment. She could feel the creature's darkness burrowing into her mind, her heart, her soul. She was becoming part of it. And then, there was nothing. The silence was all-consuming. Chapter 4. The echoes of her own despair. Lily's eyes fluttered open to an overwhelming stillness. a silence that permeated every corner of her existence. It felt like waking up underwater, where time itself was suspended, muffled, unreachable. Her senses, once sharp with fear and confusion, had dulled. Her body felt heavy, as though every limb were bound by invisible chains, pulling her deeper into a place that defied comprehension. She tried to speak, but no sound came. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive, suffocating every attempt at escape. Her mouth moved, her throat screamed, but there was only emptiness. The stillness was all-encompassing, as if the air itself had become a prison, thick with the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Is this death? She thought, though even the thought felt foreign, as if the question no longer held meaning. Was this an end, or simply another twisted form of existence? She could feel her breath, shallow, ragged, as though she were still alive, still tethered to her broken body. But the world around her? The world was different now. It was nothing like the place she had once known, nothing like the attic, nothing like the house that had once been her home. Where was she? Her eyes slowly adjusted to the dim, shifting light that seemed to emanate from nowhere. The air was thick with the smell of decay, stale, mouldy, like the damp rot of long-forgotten things. She glanced around, but the scene that met her eyes only deepened the knot of terror that had settled in her stomach. The walls, if they could even be called that, were jagged, like the bones of some monstrous creature. Twisted and angular, they loomed over her, stretching far into the darkness. They seemed to pulse with an eerie life, their surface slick and veined with black streaks that resembled veins. The floor beneath her was cold and uneven, made of rough stone, slick with moisture. Each step she took sent echoes reverberating through the space, but the sound felt wrong. It was like hearing her footsteps from a distance, distorted, alien. Where am I? She thought again, the question scratching at her mind like a frantic claw. She tried to stand, but her legs were uncooperative, shaking beneath her weight. It was as if her very body had become a stranger to her, heavy and unyielding. Her fingertips brushed the stone beneath her, the rough texture grounding her for just a moment before she forced herself to her feet. She stumbled, her hands reaching out to steady herself on the walls, but they were cold, colder than she had expected. Their surface seemed to shimmer and twist beneath her touch, as though the very material of the walls was alive, breathing, shifting in response to her presence. Lily! The voice came suddenly, a soft, whispered hiss, not from anywhere around her, but from within her, echoing in her mind. She froze, her blood turning to ice at the sound. It wasn't a voice she recognized, at least, not consciously, but the very tone of it made her skin crawl. It was too familiar, too close, like the murmurings of her own thoughts, only darker, twisted, contorted into something unrecognizable. She closed her eyes, trying to block it out, but the whisper persisted. Lily, don't you see? You're home now. You've always been home. Her eyes snapped open, and the space around her seemed to shift in response, as though the words themselves were warping the world. She stumbled back, her hands pressed against the wall, her pulse quickening with the growing dread in her chest. The walls. They were alive. They were moving, pulsing, breathing in time with her heartbeat, as if the very air had become part of something else, a vast, living entity that consumed everything it touched. The floor beneath her buckled and groaned as if in protest. The stone walls twisted, bending toward her, reaching for her like fingers seeking to pull her into the abyss. She backed away, her heart hammering in her chest, but no matter how far she moved, the walls seemed to close in. The darkness around her seemed to stretch infinitely, and with every passing moment the pressure grew, closer, tighter, suffocating. It was as if the space itself was shrinking, pulling her in, pulling her deeper into the void. You can't escape, Lily, the voice said again, this time clearer, more forceful. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a presence, an overwhelming force that seemed to permeate everything. You were always ours, just like your mother, just like the others. Lily gasped, stumbling backward, her breath catching in her throat. Her mother. The memories of the woman who had once held her in loving arms, the woman who had cared for her. Those memories felt distant now, like shadows fading in the dark. The woman who had died, who had been taken, wasn't the mother she remembered, the thing that had replaced her. It was not her. It was something else, something twisted. And now Lily could feel it. The house was part of her, and she was part of the house. The stone beneath her feet suddenly cracked open, a jagged split appearing in the floor, like some great wound opening up to reveal the heart of the house itself. Her eyes widened in terror as she saw the blackness beneath, the darkness that pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, as though it were alive. And from within the depths of that blackness, something stirred, something large, something ancient, something that had been waiting. A pair of glowing eyes appeared in the chasm, slowly rising from the depths of the blackened void. They glowed with an otherworldly light, yellow and sickly, flickering like dying embers. The creature emerged slowly, its form growing as it pulled itself from the darkness. It was humanoid, but grotesque, its limbs long and twisted, its body skeletal and emaciated, as though it had been starving for eons. Its skin, if it could be called that, was pale and stretched tight across its bones, as though it were made of paper, crinkling with every movement. Lily could feel its gaze on her, the weight of its eyes pressing into her skin, into her very soul. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. Her voice was trapped in the silence, her mouth moving in vain as the creature advanced. "You think you're different, don't you, Lily?" It rasped, its voice a chorus of whispers, as if it spoke not with its mouth but with the very air. "You think you can escape, but you've always been ours. You're just another piece, just like your mother. You are one with the house." Lily's legs trembled beneath her, her body frozen in place. The creature's form shifted, its bones creaking and snapping, as though it were being reconstructed before her eyes, its body folding and unfolding in impossible ways. The shadows around it seemed to twist and writhe, as though they too were part of the creature, bending to its will. It moved closer, the floor groaning beneath its weight, its eyes never leaving Lily's face. The closer it got, the stronger the sense of familiarity became, until it felt as if the creature had always been a part of her, a part of the house, a part of the very air she breathed. She stumbled backward, her heart racing in her chest, but there was nowhere to run. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all of it was closing in on her, the space itself collapsing, pushing her toward the center of the room, toward the creature. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, but the words were useless, lost in the oppressive silence. "No, I don't belong here." The creature's laugh was a dry, raspy sound, like paper tearing, like the crackle of flames devouring the last remnants of hope. "You already do," it whispered, its voice echoing in her mind. "You've always belonged here." The ground trembled beneath her feet, and she felt her knees buckle. She fell to the floor, her hands splayed out in front of her, as though trying to crawl away. But there was nowhere to crawl, no escape, only the darkness, the suffocating weight of it. She could feel it pressing in from all sides, enveloping her, swallowing her whole. "Lily!" The creature's voice cooed, a cold caress against her skin. "You will never leave." The room grew colder, and Lily felt the life drain from her body, the warmth slipping away, the world fading to black. And in the darkness she heard it, the whispers, countless voices, all speaking at once, all echoing the same words. "You are one of us." Chapter 5. The Hollowed Silence. Lily's mind, battered and broken, felt like it was adrift in an ocean of emptiness. The walls had closed in on her, the air suffocating, and yet, even as she slipped further into oblivion, she could feel the presence, that presence, lurking in the very corners of her consciousness. She could hear the whispers, the voices that never ceased, gnawing at her mind like hungry creatures. She had lost all sense of time, of reality. The space around her had become a blur of shadows, distorted shapes, and oppressive darkness. There was no floor beneath her feet now, no ceiling above her head. She was falling, slowly, endlessly, into something deeper. A bottomless chasm of despair, of nothingness. It was in this state of limbo, this purgatory of the mind, that Lily finally realized the truth. There was no escape. Not from this place, not from the house, not from the thing that had claimed her. It was all-consuming, all-encompassing, an entity that had taken root in her very soul, just as it had taken root in the house. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with their maddening chorus. You belong here, Lily. You are one of us. The voices stretched out to her, pulling her deeper, like invisible hands tugging at her very essence. They were no longer words, but something more. A feeling, a presence, infesting her thoughts and clouding her every breath. No, I'm not one of you. She whispered it to herself, though she no longer believed it. Her words, though weak and trembling, still clung to a shred of defiance. I'm not like you. The darkness around her seemed to shift, to pulse, as though it were listening, absorbing her resistance. And then, out of the suffocating blackness, a figure began to emerge. It was tall, shrouded in shadow, its form barely discernible, like a wraith made of smoke and decay. It moved toward her with a slow, deliberate pace, its presence bending the very space around it, warping the shadows, distorting the air. She could hear its footsteps, a soft, wet, squelching sound, as though something thick and liquid was dragging across the floor. Her heart raced. She wanted to run, to scream, but her body felt paralyzed, frozen in place, locked in the unyielding grasp of this place. The figure's eyes, those glowing, sickly yellow orbs, pierced through the darkness, fixating on her with a hunger that sent a cold shiver down her spine. She could feel its gaze tearing into her, reaching into the deepest corners of her mind, pulling at the very fabric of her being. And then it spoke. Lily. The voice was low, guttural, and yet oddly familiar. It was the same voice she had heard before, the voice that had whispered in her mind, the voice that had haunted her every thought. But now, it was more personal, more intimate. It sounded like her own voice, twisted and distorted, like a reflection of herself seen through a shattered mirror. You think you can resist, but you cannot. You have always belonged here. You have always been one of us. She wanted to scream again, to fight back, but the words died in her throat. The more she tried to resist, the tighter the grip around her chest became. It was as though the very air was becoming thicker, more oppressive, pressing against her lungs, crushing her from every side. No, she managed to croak, though the sound was barely audible. I'm not like you, I'm not one of you. But the figure only laughed, a harsh, dry sound that echoed in the empty space, reverberating through her very bones. You lie to yourself, Lily. You lie because you are afraid of the truth. The figure stepped closer, its form becoming clearer, though still shrouded in darkness. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its body seemed to shift and distort with every movement, like it was not quite solid, but something in between. Its skin was pale, cracked, and covered in veins that pulsed with a sickly, greenish glow. Lily's heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel a cold sweat breaking out on her skin. She wanted to run, to flee from this creature, but her body betrayed her. Her legs refused to move, her arms numb at her sides. It was as if she were caught in some invisible trap, held captive by the very space around her. You have been chosen, the figure continued, its voice now a whisper in her ear, sending shivers down her spine. You are the one. You are the key to everything. Lily shook her head frantically, tears stinging her eyes. I don't understand. Please. Her voice was trembling, broken. What do you want from me? The figure's eyes glowed brighter, the yellow light flickering with an unnatural intensity. It reached out a hand, long bony fingers stretching toward her. We want you, Lily. We need you. You are the one who will unlock the door to what lies beyond. Suddenly, Lily's mind was flooded with images, flashes of memories that were not her own, visions of a time long before she had ever been born. The house, Her house was older, much older, and it was alive with a presence, a dark force that pulsed within its walls. She saw her mother, her eyes wide with terror, whispering something in a language that made no sense. And then there was another figure, a shadowy, indistinct form, watching from the corner, lurking, waiting. "It's been waiting for you, Lily." The words came again, echoing in her mind, reverberating through the visions. The shadowy figure moved closer, its form growing clearer, and Lily's heart skipped a beat. It was her, or rather, it looked like her, but distorted, twisted, like a reflection in a broken mirror. It was her, but not her. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, leaving Lily breathless and shaking. She could feel the weight of its meaning sinking in. She was the key. She was the one who would open the door to whatever lay beyond. The house had chosen her, just as it had chosen her mother before her. "No," she whispered, the realization hitting her like a ton of bricks. "This is wrong. I'm not the key." But the figure didn't listen. It continued to move toward her, its bony fingers reaching closer. The air grew colder, the shadows deepened, and Lily could feel herself sinking deeper into the void. The creature's breath was ragged, its body trembling with an unnatural hunger. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as though they were demanding something from her. "You have to open it, Lily," the creature said, its voice now a low growl. "You have to unlock the door. Only you can do it." Lily's heart was racing, her chest tight with fear. She didn't know what this door was, or what it led to, but she knew one thing for certain. She didn't want to open it. She didn't want to be the key to whatever darkness this house had hidden for so long. But the creature was insistent. Its fingers were now inches from her face, its foul breath hot on her skin. She could feel its cold, skeletal hand brushing against her cheek, and in that moment, she knew there was no escaping it. "You are the door, Lily," the figure whispered, its lips curling into a grotesque smile. "And the door is you." Chapter 6. The door beyond Lily awoke to a stillness that pressed against her chest, like the weight of 1,000 forgotten dreams. Her breath, shallow and hesitant, filled the air with a fragile pulse. The room around her was empty, or so it seemed, but the air was thick with something she couldn't name, a suffocating weight that seemed to press against her very skin, seeping into her bones, into her soul. It took a moment to understand that she was no longer in the place she had been. The oppressive, shadowed world of endless darkness had dissolved like smoke in the wind, leaving her in a room bathed in dim yellow light. The walls were familiar, too familiar, but something about the space had changed. It was no longer the same. The air smelled of stale wood, mildew, and a strange sweetness, like something long dead, rotting beneath the floorboards. Lily sat up slowly, the movement stiff, as though her body had been frozen in place for too long. Her limbs ached with the strange sensation of having been suspended in time, of having been held captive in some distant dimension where time and space had no meaning. The room was quiet, unnervingly quiet, save for the low hum of something unseen, something lurking just beyond her sight. It was as though the very fabric of reality was shivering, trembling under an unseen hand. She was in the house, her house, but it no longer felt like the home she had once known. It felt wrong. Every corner, every shadow, every faint creak of the floorboard seemed to carry with it an ominous presence, a presence that had followed her, that had waited for her. And now, it was here. She could feel it, like the brush of cold fingers against the back of her neck, the steady, rhythmic pulse of something ancient and hungry just behind her thoughts. Lily stood up, her legs weak and unsteady. Her bare feet scraped against the cold wooden floor as she moved, each step a battle against the oppressive force that clung to the house. She reached for the door, her hand trembling as her fingers brushed against the cold brass handle. And for a moment, she hesitated. Was she ready to face whatever lay beyond that threshold? Was she ready to face them? She didn't know. She wasn't sure of anything anymore, but she knew she had no choice. The whispers, the voices that had tormented her for days, for weeks. Had they really been voices? Or had they been something else? Something more? They were inside her, pressing against her mind, breaking it apart piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the hollow echo of their demands. "You are the door, Lily." The words from the figure in the shadows echoed in her mind like a distant drumbeat. "And the door is you." The door. It had to be opened. She had to open it, or it would open her. With a deep breath, Lily gripped the handle and turned. The door creaked loudly in protest, a sound that seemed to reverberate through her very soul, like the mournful wail of something long dead. She stepped into the hallway, the air thick and heavy with an oppressive, suffocating force that seemed to press against her chest with every breath. The hallway stretched before her, long and narrow, its walls dark and worn, like the skin of something ancient and decayed. The faint flicker of the dim lights cast strange shadows, dancing like the twisted forms of forgotten ghosts. She could hear them now, more clearly than before, the whispers, the voices, scraping against the walls, seeping into her mind. "You belong here, Lily. You are one of us." The voices were no longer soft. They were louder now, more insistent, like 1,000 voices layered on top of each other, each one fighting for dominance. She pressed her hands against her ears, but it did no good. The whispers only grew louder, more frantic, as though they were inside her, swirling through her veins, vibrating in her skull. She stumbled forward, her mind spinning, her body moving on instinct alone. She reached the end of the hallway and stopped. The door ahead of her, the one that had been the focus of her torment, the one that had called to her, demanded that she open it, loomed in front of her like the mouth of a great abyss. It was an old, wooden door, heavy and unyielding, its surface marred by age and neglect. But it was the key to everything, to her past, to her future, to whatever had been waiting for her all along. "Open it, Lily," the voices whispered, rising in pitch, growing desperate. "Unlock it. Unlock the truth." Her heart raced. Her hands shook as she reached for the door handle. She felt the cold metal beneath her fingertips, felt it burn through her skin, as though it were alive. The moment her hand made contact, a jolt of electricity shot through her, and the door groaned. A low, guttural sound, like something ancient waking from a long, tortured sleep. With a single, fluid motion, Lily twisted the handle, and the door swung open. The room beyond was unlike anything she had ever seen. The space was vast, endless even, stretching out in all directions, the walls lost to shadow. There were no windows, no ceiling, no floor, just an infinite expanse of darkness, broken only by flickering lights that seemed to float in midair like stars in a black sky. And in the center of the room stood the figure. It was her, or at least, it looked like her. But this version of Lily was different. This version was wrong. Her body was twisted, distorted, her skin pale and cracked, like porcelain shattered by a blow. Her eyes, those eyes, were hollow, blackened voids, staring into Lily's soul with an emptiness that threatened to consume her. The figure spoke, its voice cold and emotionless, a mockery of Lily's own. "You're late," it said, its lips curling into a smile that was more of a sneer. "We've been waiting for you." Lily's heart slammed against her ribs, her chest tight with panic. The air around her felt thick, suffocating. She could hear the whispers again, but now they were louder, more frantic, their voices blending into one unified scream. "You are the key, Lily. You must unlock it." The figure reached out, its long, bony fingers stretching toward her. Lily wanted to run, to escape, but her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen, rooted to the spot, as the figure's hand came closer, closer. It touched her, lightly at first. The coldness of its touch sent a jolt of ice through her skin, spreading outward like a slow-moving poison. "You belong here, Lily," the figure whispered again, its voice sliding into her mind like a slithering serpent. "We are you. You are us. And now, the door is open." Lily gasped, her breath ragged and shallow, as the darkness around her seemed to close in, swallowing her whole. The figure loomed over her, its presence suffocating, its touch dragging her deeper into the void. And then, the world tilted. The ground beneath her feet gave way, and Lily fell into the abyss, into the darkness that had always been waiting for her. Her scream was swallowed by the endless void, a final echo in the silence that stretched on forever. "You are the door, Lily." The figure's voice rang out one final time. "And now, it is open." Chapter 6. Continued. The door, beyond Lily's scream, echoed in her own ears, though it felt distant, as if it came from another version of herself, trapped in another reality, separate from her own. Her body floated, weightless, suspended in an abyss that defied the very concept of space and time. She could no longer see the figure, the shadow that had once been her doppelganger. The black void that surrounded her was absolute, all-encompassing, and suffocating. It was like being buried beneath the earth, but without the comfort of dirt and bones. Time had no meaning here. She was suspended in a realm where seconds, minutes, hours, perhaps even years could have passed, or maybe none at all. It was impossible to tell. She tried to move, but her limbs were like lead. Every attempt to reach out, to grasp something, anything, was met with the same futile emptiness. There was nothing here, not even the comforting sensation of air on her skin. No up, no down, no direction. Then a whisper, a voice, low, soft, like a breath against the skin. "Lily." Her name, a thread of sound, brittle and fragile, floating through the void. She tried to respond, but her mouth wouldn't work. The whisper lingered, insistent, tugging at the edges of her consciousness. "You must remember." The words were faint but clear, as if spoken from the deepest recesses of her mind. She didn't want to listen, didn't want to hear them, but the voice was pulling her in, dragging her towards something familiar, something terrifying. Images began to blur at the edge of her perception. Flickers of light, flashes of memory, like a broken film reel. A door, the door she had opened, and with it, something else, something far worse. Her heart began to race as the memories flooded back, slow and agonizing. She remembered the house, her home, the place she had lived her entire life. She remembered the sounds, the smells, the sharp tang of dust in the air, the musty warmth of the wood that had made up the walls of her family's home. It had been safe once, but that safety had been shattered when she found the door in the basement, a door that had always been there, hidden behind layers of old furniture and cobwebs, locked away for reasons she hadn't understood at the time. Now, she did. The door had called to her. It had whispered to her in her dreams, in the depths of her sleep. It had promised answers. And so, she had opened it, and now, she was paying the price. "You shouldn't have opened it," the voice murmured again, and Lily felt a shiver race down her spine. The whisper was coming from every direction, wrapping itself around her like a coil of cold iron. "You shouldn't have..." "But it's too late now." Lily's breath hitched. "Too late. Too late to turn back," the voice repeated, its tone more insistent now, more certain, as if the speaker knew something she didn't. "The door has opened, and with it, the veil has been lifted. You see the truth now, don't you? You are the key. You are the door." The words twisted in her mind like a blade. A door? She had opened it. She had stepped through it. But she was the door. The thought was maddening. It was nonsensical. Yet deep down, she felt the cold weight of the truth pressing in on her chest. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to scream, to reject the idea, but something told her, no, felt, that it was all too real. She had unlocked something in herself, something that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for this moment, waiting for her to unlock it, and now there was no escaping it. What? What am I? Her voice barely broke the silence, a ragged whisper, trembling with fear. The answer came in a voice that seemed to come from within her, as if it were born from the deepest, darkest corners of her own soul. You are the threshold. The words burned her, branding her mind with their cold, hard truth. She was the threshold, the space between the living and the dead, between what was and what could be. She was the door, the doorway to something that had always been there, waiting in the darkness. The thing that whispered in the corners of her mind, that tugged at her from the depths of her soul. The void around her shifted. The blackness swirled like a storm of ink, and with it came a new presence. A sensation that crawled under her skin, a feeling of eyes watching, of something unseen closing in around her. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her throat. The air thickened, growing heavier by the second, pressing against her, suffocating her. And then it appeared. At first, it was a shape, a shadow, a distortion in the darkness. But as it drew closer, the shape became clearer, more distinct. It was a figure, tall and thin, its body bent at unnatural angles. Its face was obscured by shadows, its features hidden behind a mask of darkness. But Lily could feel its gaze, cold, unfeeling, like the weight of 1,000 years of suffering. It was watching her, and it knew her. "You've come far, Lily," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant, like the sound of a bell tolling in the distance. It was a voice that seemed to echo through her very bones, shaking her to the core. "But you've only just begun. There is so much more waiting for you." Lily felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world, as if time itself meant nothing to it. It was a creature of the void, a being that existed beyond the realm of understanding. It was something older than the stars, something born from the very fabric of darkness. "You opened the door," the figure continued, its voice wrapping around her like chains. "And now you must walk through it. But know this, once you pass through the threshold, you will never return. You will become one of us. You will become a part of the darkness." Lily's heart raced, panic clawing at her insides. She had known deep down that this moment was coming. She had felt it, even before she opened the door. But now that it was here, the reality of it was overwhelming. The horror of what awaited her was too much to bear. But before she could respond, the figure raised a hand, and with a single fluid motion, the darkness swirled around her, pulling her in. She struggled, but it was useless. The shadows consumed her, wrapping around her like a cocoon of cold despair. And in that moment, as the void closed in, Lily understood. The door wasn't just a door. It was a prison, a trap, and now she was its prisoner. Chapter 7. The Last Whisper. The world around Lily had become a suffocating, endless sea of shadows. A void where no light existed, where no warmth dared to linger. Time had lost its meaning, slipping away like water through her fingers. She could no longer tell if minutes had passed or if days, weeks, or years had gone by. The place she found herself in, this haunting realm, was beyond the realm of comprehension. She stood in the center of it, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing down on her from every direction. Her limbs were heavy, as though she were shackled by invisible chains. Every breath she took felt labored, as if the air itself was poison. Yet she was not alone. In the far distance, something moved, something that should not have been. The shape was ever-changing, twisting and contorting as though it existed outside of normal space and time. It was a silhouette, shifting constantly, its form never steady enough for her to grasp, and from it came the faintest sound, a whisper that seemed to originate from the very walls of her mind. "Lily." The voice was familiar, but at the same time, utterly alien. It was her name, but it was spoken in a tone so cold, so hollow, it could not have been from anything living. She felt it in her bones, felt it as if it was calling her from the very depths of the earth, from the abyss of the unknown. Lily took a hesitant step forward, her body moving as if through thick water, each movement slow and deliberate. Her heart thudded painfully against her chest, its rhythm erratic, as though it were trying to escape her body. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape this place, but there was nowhere to go. The whisper came again, this time louder, clearer, as though the being had drawn closer, as though it was no longer a mere echo in the distance, but a presence standing directly beside her. "Lily, you've opened the door, but you've only seen the beginning." Her breath caught in her throat. The voice was unlike any she had heard before, cold, ancient, filled with a knowledge so vast it made her head spin. It resonated with a terrible finality, as though the words were written in the stars long before she had been born. The shadows around her shifted again, swirling with purpose, as though the very fabric of the darkness was alive, pulsating with the heartbeat of something vast and eternal. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the blackness, but it was like touching smoke, elusive, intangible. The moment her hand made contact, a wave of cold flooded her senses, numbing her to the core. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered again. But this time, it was not just a whisper. It was a command, a decree from some unseen force that chilled her very soul. Lily turned, searching for the source of the voice, but all she saw was the ever-expanding void. She was alone, or so she thought. A flicker of movement in the corner of her eye caught her attention. She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest, but saw nothing. The flicker was gone, yet the sense of being watched, of being hunted, intensified. It was as though invisible eyes were fixed on her every move. Her pulse quickened, panic beginning to rise like bile in her throat. She could feel her sanity slipping, her grip on reality weakening with every passing second. Was this some kind of dream? A nightmare she couldn't wake from? But the darkness, it felt real. The sensation of the cold, the oppressive weight of it, the way the silence pressed against her ears, suffocating her thoughts. It was all too real. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't some fleeting illusion. She was trapped. The voice came again, this time with an undercurrent of something darker, something more primal. "The door has been opened, Lily. The barrier between this world and the next is broken. There is no going back now." She could feel it. The barrier, the space between her world and the otherworldly realm she had unleashed. It was a thin, fragile thing, stretched so thin that it could snap at any moment. It was that very threshold she had crossed when she first opened the door that had once been hidden, locked away for reasons she had never understood, had now become her prison. The thing behind the voice, this creature, this presence, was growing bolder. Its form began to take shape, slowly but steadily, and Lily could see it now. The edges of its shadow seemed to bleed into the surrounding blackness, its silhouette growing clearer with every passing moment. It was no longer just a shape. It was a figure, a towering being with long, jagged limbs that reached out from the depths of the void like tendrils of decay. It was tall, so tall it seemed to scrape the very fabric of the universe. Its skin was not flesh, but something else entirely. Something like stone, but black, with veins that pulsed with an eerie light, like the glow of distant stars. Its face was nothing. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a blank, hollow space where a face should have been. A face that stared into Lily's soul. A face that held 1,000 secrets and 1,000 horrors. "You are mine now," the voice said, its tone full of malice. "You opened the door, and now you belong to me." Lily stumbled back, her heart racing, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. She didn't know what it was, what this thing was, but she knew it wasn't human. It wasn't anything human. It was something beyond understanding, something that existed in the spaces between the worlds, lurking in the cracks of existence. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No, I don't belong to you. I won't." But before she could finish, the thing stepped forward, its movement unnaturally swift, like a predator closing in on its prey. It extended one of its jagged limbs, and Lily froze, unable to move. The air seemed to grow colder still, the pressure building around her, suffocating her with its intensity. She wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything to escape, but her body wouldn't respond. It was as if she were trapped in a nightmare she could not wake from, a nightmare that was her reality. The being's presence loomed closer, its form so vast it seemed to fill the entire space. The blackness swallowed her whole, wrapping around her like a shroud. And then, the whisper came again, closer this time, so close that it was as if the voice were right beside her ear. "You've crossed the threshold, Lily. You can't turn back. You belong to the darkness now. You always have." The words cut through her like a knife, each one tearing at the fabric of her mind. And in that moment, Lily knew she was no longer herself. She had become something else, something darker, something that existed only in the places where the light could not reach. The void closed in around her, and Lily felt herself being consumed by it. But before the darkness could fully claim her, something inside her broke. A spark of resistance flared in the depths of her soul, as if a tiny sliver of the person she once was had managed to survive. A fleeting thought flashed through her mind, the memory of the door. The door! She had opened it, and now she had to close it. Chapter 8. The Weight of Silence. Lily's mind was fractured, broken into pieces like shards of glass. Each fragment of her consciousness rattled in the cage of her skull, trying to make sense of the horrors that surrounded her. The shadow had taken root in her world, and she felt it everywhere. Its presence was a constant pressing weight, like a shadow that stretched and expanded with every heartbeat. She had opened the door. The realization echoed in her mind like the toll of a distant bell, a bell whose sound grew louder with every passing second, a ringing reminder of the mistake she had made, the decision that had brought her to this moment of despair. The door was not just a passage, it was a breach, a rift between worlds, and once opened, there was no way to undo the damage. As Lily stumbled through the blackness, the weight of the silence threatened to crush her. There was no sound here, no birds, no wind, no rustling of leaves. Only the deep, oppressive quiet that enveloped her, like a suffocating blanket, pressing in from every direction. She had no idea how long she had been wandering. Hours, days, weeks. It didn't matter. Time had become irrelevant. The only thing that existed now was the feeling of the void around her, the sense that she was being watched by eyes that were not of this world. Lily's heart thudded in her chest as she tried to steady her breathing, but each inhalation was sharp and shallow. Her limbs felt heavy, like she was moving underwater. The air was thick with something that made it difficult to think, to reason. Her thoughts were clouded, slipping away like sand through her fingers. A cold draft brushed against her skin, and she shuddered involuntarily. The sensation was so unnatural, so wrong, that it sent a chill straight to her bones. It was as if the very atmosphere around her had turned against her, had become a living, breathing entity, suffused with malice and intent. Then, the whisper came again. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, more distinct, as if the entity, whatever it was drawing closer. "You cannot hide from it." The voice, no, it wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a presence, an overpowering, suffocating presence that seemed to penetrate her very soul. It spoke not only to her ears, but to the very essence of her being, gnawing at her thoughts, burrowing into her consciousness. Lily's breath caught in her throat as she spun around, searching for the source of the voice. But the void remained unchanged, dark, empty, endless. It was as if the words had emerged from the fabric of the darkness itself, as though the very air around her had been laced with them. "You've made your choice," the voice continued, its tone dark and heavy, each word imbued with an unholy weight. "And now, there is no escape." The words slithered into her mind, twisting her thoughts, trying to break her. The darkness was not just a physical force. It was a presence that sought to invade her very being, to consume her from the inside out. She could feel it gnawing at her, whispering things that didn't make sense, but that somehow felt so true, so undeniable. "You are bound here," the voice whispered again. "You belong to the darkness now." Her legs buckled beneath her, and she fell to her knees, the coldness of the ground seeping through her clothes like ice. She wanted to scream, to fight, to push back against the crushing weight of the darkness. But she couldn't. It was as if the air itself had become too thick to breathe, too dense to move through. The shadows around her twisted and stretched, the blackness contorting as though it had a life of its own. They wrapped around her, coiling like serpents, and she could feel the chill of them creeping into her skin, invading her body, her thoughts. And then she saw it. There, in the distance, a faint glow. It was barely noticeable at first, like a distant star on the horizon. But as she strained her eyes, the light grew brighter, sharper, until it was all she could focus on. It was not the warm, welcoming light of the sun, but a cold, unnatural glow, a sickly pale light that pulsed like a heartbeat. It called to her, "Come closer." Lily's body responded before her mind had time to protest. Her legs moved, dragging her toward the light, each step feeling like it was pulling her further away from her sanity. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, jagged, like walking through the remains of something long destroyed. Her hands trembled as she reached out, drawn toward the glow as though it were a lifeline, a way out of the suffocating darkness. But as she drew nearer, the light revealed something that made her blood run cold. A door. It stood alone in the middle of the void, a door framed by the same sickly glow. It was old, ancient even, its wood dark and rotted, the edges splintered and cracked. There was no handle, no keyhole. It was just there, an impenetrable barrier in the middle of nowhere. Lily's breath hitched in her throat as she stared at the door, the sense of something terrible growing in the pit of her stomach. She knew, with an unshakable certainty, that this door was tied to everything. The darkness, the void, the creature that haunted her. It was the source, the origin of all of it. But why was it here? And more importantly, why was she so drawn to it? "You must open it," the voice urged again, now clearer, as though it had been speaking from within her own mind. "You have no choice." She had opened one door already, and look where it had gotten her. Was this another mistake? Another trap set by the very thing that had been following her? But she could feel it, deep down, gnawing at her, urging her forward. The door was not just a door. It was a part of her now, part of the ritual she had unknowingly started. Opening it was the only way to stop it, to end this. With a trembling hand, she reached out toward the door, her fingers brushing against its surface. The wood was cold, so cold, colder than anything she had ever felt. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she pressed her palm against it, feeling the vibration of something ancient, something malevolent, thrumming just beneath the surface. And then, the door opened. A sharp crack echoed in the silence, as though the very fabric of the void had been torn apart. The light from the door spilled out, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to writhe and recoil in the glow. Lily stepped through, and for the first time since entering this place, she felt the slightest glimmer of warmth. But that warmth was fleeting. In an instant, it turned to ice. Beyond the door was no sanctuary, no safe haven, only more darkness, more silence. And as Lily took a hesitant step forward, she felt the air around her grow thick again, as if the very atmosphere was closing in, pressing against her with unimaginable force. And that's when she saw it. The thing from her nightmares. The thing that had been haunting her since the moment she stepped into this nightmare. It was standing there, waiting. The figure, a shadow, a being beyond form, stood in the center of the room. It was waiting, its presence an all-consuming darkness that seemed to draw in the light, suffocating it. And it was smiling. Chapter 9. The hunger beneath Lily's heart raced in her chest, her breath a shallow gasp as she stood frozen in place, staring at the figure before her. Its form was shapeless, a mass of swirling blackness, an absence of light that seemed to devour everything in its vicinity. It was not human, of that she was certain, but it wasn't just a creature either. No, it was something much older, much darker, a force that existed before time itself. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed faintly with an unnatural red hue, like the embers of a dying fire. They were empty, hollow, yet they locked onto Lily with a force that made her entire body tremble. The gaze wasn't just a look, it was an invasion. It pierced through her skin, through her soul, as though it could see every secret, every fear she had ever hidden from the world. The voice came again, but this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a deep, resonant growl that reverberated through the very air, shaking the ground beneath her feet. You opened the door. Now, you are mine. The words felt like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. She tried to speak, to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if her throat had closed up, as if her very body had stopped functioning. Her muscles were frozen, as if the shadows around her were holding her in place. The figure took a step forward, and the ground beneath its feet seemed to warp, like reality itself was bending to its will. The air grew colder, the chill biting into her bones. The shadows that surrounded them thickened, swirling in an almost hypnotic dance. The room, if it could even be called that, seemed to pulse with the same malevolent energy that emanated from the creature. Every inch of the space felt wrong, like it had been carved from the very fabric of nightmare itself. Lily wanted to run. She needed to run. But her legs would not obey. Her mind screamed at her to escape, but the fear paralyzed her. Her eyes remained locked on the being before her. And the longer she looked, the more she felt herself slipping into its gaze, losing herself in the endless blackness of its form. Then, it spoke again, its voice a slow, deliberate hiss, as if savoring every word. You think you can leave. You think you can escape. The words were laced with a mockery that made her stomach churn. The door you opened is not for leaving. It is for binding, for taking. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had thought that by opening the door, she would be able to find some sort of escape, some way to undo the horrors that had already begun to unfold. But the door was not a means of leaving. It was the beginning of something else, something far worse than she could have ever imagined. You are already part of this world now, the figure continued. Your soul is bound to the shadows. You will serve the darkness, just like all the others who have come before you. Lily's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced. The others. What others? Had there been others who had opened the door? Others who had made the same mistake she had? She couldn't remember. The terror of the moment clouded her thoughts, making it difficult to focus. But she had to understand. She had to find a way out. The creature took another step forward, its form shifting, distorting as if it was more an idea than a being, more a concept than a creature of flesh and bone. It was the embodiment of the darkness itself, a living, breathing manifestation of fear, despair, and hunger. The shadows around it thickened, swirling like a storm, coiling and twisting in on themselves. The room seemed to shrink with each passing second, the walls closing in like the jaws of some unseen predator. You think you can resist? The being sneered, its voice dripping with disdain. You think you can fight me? You are already mine, Lily. You always have been. It was at that moment that Lily understood. This wasn't a creature she could fight, not in the traditional sense. It wasn't a monster that could be slain with a weapon or banished with a spell. This thing, this entity, was beyond that. It existed in the fabric of the universe itself, a dark force that fed on fear, on the very essence of life. It was a hunger that could not be satiated, a hunger that had been gnawing at the world for eons, waiting for a way in. No one escapes, the creature growled. No one ever has, and no one ever will. The air grew heavy with the weight of its words, and Lily felt a coldness seep into her very soul, a chilling emptiness that threatened to swallow her whole. She could feel the shadows pulling at her, drawing her closer, tightening their grip around her body. It was as if they were trying to swallow her up, to consume her completely. Her pulse raced as her mind scrambled for a solution, any solution. She couldn't die here. She couldn't let this thing take her. She had to find a way to fight back. But what could she do? The door was already open. She had no weapon. She had nothing. And then she remembered the book. It was all she had. The book that had brought her here. The one she had found in the library. The one that had described this very thing. The rituals, the warnings, the rules of the door. It was all in that book, buried in the words she had skimmed over so carelessly. She had missed something, something important, something that might still give her a chance. With every ounce of strength she could muster, Lily pulled herself from the crushing grasp of the darkness stumbling backward toward the place where she had seen the book. The shadows recoiled slightly as though reluctant to let her go, but they did not stop her. She reached the table where the book lay, its pages stained and worn. Her hands trembled as she grabbed it, flipping through the pages frantically. She had to find it. She had to find the ritual, the incantation, the answer. The creature watched her from the shadows, its eyes burning with an intensity that made her blood run cold. "It won't help you," it crooned. "You are already mine. You cannot undo what has been done." But Lily ignored it. She had no choice but to ignore it. Her fingers flew over the pages, her eyes scanning for any mention of a way to reverse the ritual, any clue that might save her. And then, her eyes landed on it. A single line, simple but unmistakable. "The door may be closed, but the price for opening it is steep. Only when the hunger is fed will the door be sealed." The hunger. The words struck her like lightning, and she knew immediately what they meant. The thing, the darkness, it wasn't just after her soul, it was after something more. It was hungry. She wasn't just its prey, she was its meal. Chapter 10. The Price of Escape. The room around Lily seemed to close in tighter with every passing second. The shadows, once swirling ominously in the periphery, now grew more defined, like long, gnarled fingers reaching toward her from every corner. The figure, the darkness itself, watched her with its burning eyes, an unsettling calm settling over its form. She couldn't tell how long she had been standing there, trembling, her mind struggling to focus on the words of the book, but it felt like an eternity. The weight of the creature's presence was suffocating, like a vice tightening around her chest. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, the air thick with an oppressive energy that made it hard to think clearly. The hunger, the words she had read just moments ago echoed in her mind. She had found the clue, the answer, but what did it truly mean? And more importantly, what was the price? Lily's hands shook as she flipped through the pages again, desperate to find more. There had to be something else, some part of the ritual she had missed. She had to know how to feed the hunger, how to satisfy the thing that had already claimed her soul. The creature took a step forward, its presence growing more powerful, more tangible, as if the very air in the room bent toward it. Its voice rang out again, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through her bones. "You still think you can escape, don't you? You think you can feed me and then walk away as if nothing has happened?" Lily's mind screamed in protest, but she clung to the book, her fingers flipping frantically. She had to. She had to find the answer. Her heart hammered against her ribcage, and for a moment she thought she might suffocate from the sheer terror crushing down on her. Then, as if it had been waiting for her to give up, a cold laugh echoed from the darkness. It reverberated around the room, making her skin crawl. "You are too late, Lily. The door is already open. The hunger cannot be satisfied by mere rituals. The price has already been paid." The words chilled her to the bone. Her eyes shot up from the pages of the book, and she saw the darkness beginning to expand, swallowing everything in its path. The air itself seemed to warp around the creature, twisting and distorting, as though reality was no longer obeying its natural laws. Lily gasped, her eyes widening as she realized what was happening. The creature was growing stronger. It was feeding on her fear, on her soul, on everything she had ever been. And the worst part was that she was powerless to stop it. Her gaze shifted back to the book. Desperation clawed at her as she tried to make sense of the cryptic passage she had found. But it was no use. The words, the language, it was all foreign to her now. What had once seemed like a clear path to survival was now an impossible riddle, a puzzle with no solution. "You are mine," the creature growled, its voice thick with venom. "You will never leave. You will never be free." Lily felt the coldness of its words seep deep into her, into the very marrow of her bones. The room, the world itself, seemed to warp and twist around her, the walls bending in on themselves, the shadows consuming every inch of space. She was no longer in control, she was drowning in it. Her vision blurred, and for a fleeting moment, Lily thought she saw a flicker of light, an image of a door, a way out. But the vision disappeared as quickly as it had come, swallowed by the endless darkness. "No one leaves," the creature whispered again. "You will be like the others, a part of the darkness, forever." Lily's mind spun, her breath shallow, but she refused to give up. Her gaze locked onto the book once more, and her heart skipped a beat. There it was, a single, barely noticeable sentence at the bottom of the page, hidden in the margins, as if it had been waiting for her to notice it. "The price may be steep, but it is not eternal. The hunger can be sated if the one who opens the door knows what to offer." The words sent a shiver of dread down her spine. What to offer? What could she possibly offer to the thing that had already taken her soul, that had already begun to consume her? The book seemed to hum in her hands, the air around her vibrating with an energy she couldn't explain. It was as if the book itself had come alive, responding to her thoughts, to her fear. "You will never escape, Lily," the creature repeated, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "Your soul belongs to me. It has always belonged to me." Lily shook her head, her pulse racing. She had to find a way. She couldn't let it win. She couldn't become one of its victims. Her hands clenched into fists around the book, and she began to read faster, her eyes scanning the words in a frenzy. Then, something caught her eye. To break the bond, the one who opened the door must return the hunger's price. Return the hunger's price. The words were vague, cryptic, but they gave her something to work with. Return the price. What did that mean? What could she give? Suddenly, her mind flashed to the visions she had seen before, the eerie figures in the mirrors, the silhouettes of people long lost, their faces twisted in eternal torment. They had all opened the door. They had all paid the price. But what had been taken from them? Lily closed her eyes, and it hit her like a flood. Her heart, her soul. The price wasn't a physical object. It wasn't a piece of gold or a sacrifice in the traditional sense. It was her life, her very essence. She had to offer the darkness something more than just fear. She had to offer herself. But the thought was maddening. The price was too high. Could she do it? Could she give up everything she was to escape the grasp of the creature, to sever the bond that had already begun to take hold? "You cannot escape, Lily. You cannot give me what I need. You are mine." Her body trembled as the creature's voice echoed in her ears, but her mind was set. She had no other choice. The price was steep, yes, but she was willing to pay it. She had to. Lily stood up, her knees buckling beneath her, but her determination burning through the fear. She clutched the book tightly in her hands and whispered the words aloud, an incantation she barely understood, but one that had been etched into her mind. The shadows trembled. The figure before her let out a guttural scream, its form writhing in agony as the book began to glow, a piercing light emerging from its pages. The creature's hold on her wavered for the briefest moment, and Lily knew this was her chance. The light blazed brighter, and for a brief, terrifying second, she thought she might be consumed by it. But she stood firm, closing her eyes and summoning every ounce of strength she had left. She had to face the darkness head on. She had to fight for her life. And as the light exploded outward, the room fell silent. The creature's voice ceased, its presence fading into the ether as if it had never existed. But Lily knew better. The door had been closed, but she had paid the price. She had given everything, and yet she was still here. The darkness had been banished. For now. Chapter 10. The Price of Escape continued. The silence that enveloped Lily felt unnatural, like the breath before a storm. The room, once suffused with oppressive shadows, now appeared unchanged, though she knew better. The darkness still lingered on the edges of her consciousness, but it was no longer tangible, no longer present, at least not in the way it had been. She was free for now. She stood in the center of the room, the book still clutched tightly in her hands, its pages now limp, the edges frayed. It seemed lighter. She glanced down at it, her pulse still racing from the ritual, the incantation that had been whispered under her breath moments before. The words had been foreign, as if they were not meant for human lips, but they had worked. The air in the room had shifted, and the dark figure, its hunger, had momentarily retreated, disappearing into the abyss from which it came. Lily took a shaky breath. She was alive. She was still herself. But was she? A cold sensation ran down her spine as her thoughts turned darker. The figure had warned her. The price has been paid. What did that mean exactly? Could she really escape this nightmarish grasp? The light from the book had seared through her mind, creating a brief, blinding moment of clarity. But now the uncertainty crept back, curling in the corners of her thoughts. She felt an unease rising in her chest, a hollow emptiness, as if something had been taken, something irreplaceable. She couldn't tell what it was, but it was there, gnawing at her insides. Turning her attention back to the room, Lily noticed that the edges of the walls had begun to blur, like the atmosphere itself was distorting, shifting. It was subtle at first, but soon she felt the space around her stretch, as though the very foundation of reality was beginning to bend. The furniture she had once been familiar with, the same chairs, the same table, seemed to fade in and out of existence, as if they were nothing more than ghosts lingering in a dream. Had it worked? The faint, echoing laughter from before reverberated through her mind, causing her to flinch, her hands tightening around the book as if for reassurance. But the laughter didn't come from the room. It came from within her, from her own soul. Her knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, her breath quickening as she tried to steady herself. The room was spinning now, and the darkness that had once been a threat seemed to be creeping back, filling the air with an oppressive weight. No longer in the form of the shadowy creature, it was as though the darkness was in her, consuming her from the inside out. She gripped the book tightly, her knuckles turning white as she fought to stay grounded in the present. The words from the pages had created a breach, but had they sealed it permanently? Or was she still tethered to the very force she had sought to escape? The answer came to her in a rush of images, distorted faces, long-forgotten voices, and glimpses of figures whose names she couldn't recall, but whose eyes were forever seared into her memory. The people whose lives had been taken by the thing she had awoken. They were all there, all around her, their souls trapped in an eternal limbo, echoes of their final screams ringing in her ears. Her pulse surged as her thoughts raced. What if it's not over? What if she had merely sealed herself in a cage of her own making, a cage where the darkness would never truly fade? The price. Lily's hand pressed to her chest as if to physically hold herself together. She couldn't help but wonder, had I given too much? The figure's words returned to her. You are mine, you will never leave. But something within her, something primal and furious, rebelled at that thought. No, I won't be a prisoner. I refuse. Her eyes darted to the walls once more. They had faded further, but something else was happening now. The room was warping, shifting between moments in time. It was like the past and present had collided, merging into a single moment of eternal dread. Then, she saw it. In the corner of her vision, the reflection of a figure standing just outside the threshold of the room. It was tall, thin, almost skeletal, with eyes that glowed a sickly yellow. The creature from before, she hadn't defeated it. It had only grown stronger, slipping out of the confines of the ritual she had performed. She turned her head to face it, her pulse hammering in her ears. The creature's face was twisted in a grotesque mockery of a smile, its features elongated and malformed. It stepped forward, its eyes locking onto hers, gleaming with an insatiable hunger. And Lily understood. It's not just my soul it wants. It wants everything. My past, my future, my very essence. She tried to move, but her body was frozen, as if bound by invisible chains. The creature stretched its arms wide, its fingers curving like claws, each one reaching toward her with impossible speed. Her vision swam as the walls around her seemed to shrink. Suddenly, she was falling through an abyss of darkness, a swirling vortex of voices and memories, voices that screamed her name, begged her to stop. The cold touch of the creature's fingers brushed against her skin, searing her with an icy fire that pierced deeper than anything physical. Then, everything stopped. Lily opened her eyes. She was no longer in the room. She wasn't even sure where she was. All she knew was that she had been cast into another place. A place of eternal twilight, with no sun, no moon, just a faint, sickly glow emanating from the depths of an impossible horizon. The creature was there, watching her from the shadows. It had changed, though. Its form now more fluid, as if it could be anything, anywhere. Its presence was a suffocating weight, a pressure that stole the very air from her lungs. Lily opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Then the voice spoke again, low and mocking. "You cannot escape, Lily. Not from me, not from yourself." And in that moment she realized the truth. She was already gone. It had taken her piece by piece, long before the ritual had even begun. It wasn't the book that had opened the door. It was her. She had always been the key, the catalyst, the one to release the darkness. She was the one who had fed it, who had welcomed it. Her body was not her own anymore. It was an empty vessel, a puppet, a plaything for the thing that haunted her. The price was not just her soul, it was her very existence. And in the place between life and death, where shadows stretched and twisted into horrors unimaginable, Lily understood there was no escape. Not for her, not for anyone. Her final scream was swallowed by the endless void.